momentum is going to come out of health and connectedness. And so I think it's always healthy. It's always good practice to be self-reflective and to think, whatever framework you use. I mean, we've used Breakout Churches to help us think through that. But I think that practice of examining yourself, making sure that everyone's with you is important, whether you're plateauing or not.
Welcome everyone back to the Shock Absorber podcast. It is awesome to have you along with us, whether you are watching us on YouTube or you're just listening in your ears from
listening in your ears.
That's usually where you listen, isn't it?
It's often the case.
Yeah.
Well, no, I used to say back at the start, I used to say consuming us via your eyeballs or something like that because we'd only just gone onto YouTube. But yes, welcome back everyone to the Shock Absorber podcast. I feel like I've got a few things to address before we start this episode. Number one is Karen. Welcome. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, and I'm concerned about what you need to address, but
no. Just welcome to the podcast. Okay. It's lovely to have you on here.
Thank you.
With Tim and I.
Yep.
Taking the place of Stu because he's overseas in America. So, thank you for joining us. You started with the first episode with us
this season,
and we're gonna top and tail
bookend it.
Yeah, that's right. Bookend it. Top and tail, bookend it. Great use of what are those words called? Not analogy. What's that called? Can't remember. Like a saying. Anyway, doesn't matter. We'll move on. The second thing to address is Tim. You are here as one of our regular co-hosts.
Yes.
And as always, I like to really critique what you're wearing. But today is a really good thing to talk about, a really exciting thing to talk about. Is that, what does it say on the front? Sorry?
So my shirt says The Cross, the Tomb and Me.
What's that in reference to?
Which was in reference to a kids camp that I took a number of our crew along to last weekend. At the time of recording, it was last weekend. Yeah. It's called Square One. It's run by YouthWorks, so I kind of get to wear both hats, my YouthWorks hat and my Soul Revival hat when I go, which is lots of fun. But I primarily was there hanging out with our Soul Revival kids this weekend, which was lots of fun. So we had 22 kids and 4 leaders, but the whole camp was about 350 kids and 100 leaders.
Wow!
So it was nice, lots of fun, lots of chaos. Really great, typical kids camp, lots of activities and water slides and lots of food and late nights and all that kind of stuff. But the teaching was by one of my colleagues, Adam Jolliffe, and he's a master storyteller. He does magic, he does big drawing, really does all that upfront presentational kids ministry just exceptionally well. And so, it was really lovely to sit under his leadership. And he just took us through those last couple of days of Jesus' life leading up to the cross, to the arrest, the trial, Jesus' death, resurrection, and then wrapped it all up. And it was the cross, the tomb and me. And the big question at the end is, so what? What has this got to do with us as primary school kids in 2022? It was really lovely to be there and to help share that with our crew, and we'd spent time in small groups where we sort of debriefed that, what it means just for our kids. And all the different churches do that. So every church comes with kids and leaders. So it's a really well running camp that runs in winter and spring, and they're now both sell out every year. So we're going to plant an extra one next year. So instead of 2 weekends, it'll be 3 weekends next year to run.
Fantastic.
That's great.
Square One. So this one, pretty much all 450 tickets sold out within 5 days of it opening. So it's something that is resonating well with churches who want to do this kind of a camp, and it's particularly designed for churches that are not big enough to bother running their own. When you run a camp, there's a huge amount of overheads that you have to think about and administration. And if your entire Sunday school is 6 kids, you're not going to run a camp. And so that's who we really cater for, is for small to medium-sized churches that wouldn't run their own kids camp but want to have that experience of having a weekend away with their leaders and with their kids. And we do it with whole churches so that the leaders who are looking after the kids are the same ones that they've already got a really well-established relationship with and are going to continue debriefing and having that relationship with as they go back and are involved in their weekly ministry. So, it's lots of fun.
Yeah, sounds cool. You mentioned Adam's teaching there, but is there one particular highlight that really you can remember from the camp?
One particular highlight. There's lots of great stuff. There was one. I don't know. I can't really think. As I said, he loves magic. Like every talk had a magic element to it that he was putting together. Some of which I saw him do this series of talks in winter because I was there with my YouthWorks hat on, and there was one that I just did not know, and he's now explained it to me.
The magic trick.
The magic trick. Yeah.
How he actually did it.
Yeah, how he actually did it. So it involves having
magic.
Yeah, it's just magic. Yeah, but he's got a frame with 4 blocks of wood in it, and they're all sitting pretty tightly in the frame. And he's got another small square, and it was really cool. So you had the 4 different pictures that represented the 4 talks, and the little block in the middle said me. So I was like, well, where do we fit in the story? And he pulled the pieces out, talked about each one, what the picture represented, put them back in, and all of a sudden there was a square the right size in the middle.
Oh, right.
And the pieces hadn't changed, the frame hadn't changed, but all of a sudden there was now space in the middle for me. And that's
a great way to illustrate it.
It was a great way to illustrate it, and it's really fun to. And I could hear leaders and kids murmuring around us in the hall, going, "What? How did he? That didn't fit." It was really fun.
No, that's awesome. So, we always start most of our episodes here on the Shock Absorber with a story or cultural artifact. That's the story, and I think the cultural artifact is actually behind you as well, which is what we call a signing wall. It's a signing and photo wall, I suppose, from our 30th anniversary celebrations. 30 years as a ministry, 10 years as a church. And we've got a lot of photos up there mainly from when we were, from the time we started as a church, but lots of people on there have signed it that maybe don't even come to Sorrow Bible Church, but came on the night that we celebrated this, and they've actually signed their names. And so it was a really cool way to commemorate something that we were doing a lot of commemorating, but a good way to commemorate the night, to have lots of people there that hadn't come for a very long time, we hadn't seen for a while, but being a big part of Sorrow Revival. So if you are seeing that on YouTube, that's why it looks very different to what we've had before on the background there. So any reflections on that, Karen, from the 30th anniversary, 30/10?
Oh, it was really great to have so many people here reflecting on their time. It was really nice to hear from the volunteer pastors who were there from the beginning and some of their highlights.
You've been a big part of the volunteer pastor process as well for our church.
Yeah, but not here from the beginning though. But it was really lovely to just spend some time reflecting on what God has done. Particularly, I guess the last few years have been hard for a lot of people, and reflecting on the fact that even in hard times, God's with us. We've continued to grow through all of that, which hasn't been the experience of all churches, but. Even though it's been tough, there's so much to celebrate, and it was really lovely to do that together. Yeah,
I mentioned this on something similar on the Ship Lunch podcast, which is our other podcast that we do, and talking about how it was actually also a confirmation, the first confirmation we've done here at Sorrow Bible Church too, and the synchronicity of there was a timeline that someone from our church did up from the full 30 years. And on there is Ethan, our youth pastor. He's been on this podcast before, of saying he was the first Sorrow Revival baby, and then here, where we are a few weeks ago, getting confirmed as the first Sorrow Revival baby. Now he's 24, getting confirmed. So that was a really nice linkage between the past and what's looking forward to the future.
And we've always said that we're not celebrating all of the churches that we plant, but all the people who come to know Jesus through the churches. And so what a great way of demonstrating in a really tangible way how important that is to us, having so many people standing up there being confirmed.
And also the exciting thing is looking forward as well. It's worth looking back. I think it's really helpful to look back and really lovely to see what God's done, but also what God's going to do in the future, because a lot of the people that were getting confirmed as well were some of the first people that came to youth when we first started at Sorrel Bible Church. It was probably 7 or 8 years ago. I probably might be incorrect on the timeline there, but it's about 8 years ago. And then they're standing up the front. Yeah. Either Ethan was part of the leadership group of that, but all the crew that grew up with that too. Yeah. So there's plenty to look forward to in the future as well, which I think that's what the night was about as well.
Yeah.
So back to the shock absorber though. We're reaching the end of this season, which we called Momentum in Ministry, and we thought it'd be worth, in this episode, reflecting on some of the things that we've learned and talked about. We started this season the full knowledge of like what we were trying to look forward to now that COVID restrictions had ended, the disruptions that they had caused. We were talking here as a staff team at Sorrel Bible Church. We saw 2022 as a bit of a rebuilding process, and Stu used the analogy of like, we're running a resort that's in North Queensland that's just had a cyclone come through and cause a fair bit of disruption and destruction. Yeah. And the thing that I really liked is like, we're still pulling the deck chairs out of the pool and rebuilding some of the things, rearranging the plants, all that kind of stuff. So we saw it as an opportunity to build in momentum perhaps in the ministries that we move forward. It also coincided this season with our annual planning day, which kind of happened in the middle of us recording this, and also, as we said, the 30th/10th anniversary thing. So it was all kind of came well together. But I think, Karen, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you're our training pastor here at Sorrel Church, but you kind of came up with the idea as well, because it also helps doing this season will feed into our Berea training program, which will happen later. But I was just wondering, why did you see it as an important topic to kind of look at?
Yeah. Well, when we started talking about it, we was just finishing a subject on church planting, and we were looking at, what's the sort of model of church planting that we do here, and what are the core things that are needed for success. And we got to the sort of end of that subject, and we talked about, well, that's great to plant, but we need to grow, and how do we maintain momentum in a new plant. And I was sort of drawing on some of Jim Collins's concepts in talking about that, which reminded me of this Breakout Churches book. I'd read it many years ago and hadn't really used it much in training beyond that, but it brought that back up. And as I was thinking about where are we as a church, and we were also talking about planning day and themes of the future and stuff like that. It was about we're in a place where we need to rebuild some, as you said, pull the deck chairs out of the pool, get our teams back running, strengthen and solidify some of the practices and the teams and the structures that we had in place before COVID. But we don't want to just do that. One of the big themes, I think, in Good to Great and in Breakout Churches is that sometimes the good can be the thief of the great. And so we didn't want to just set everything back up and have everything running well and good again. We actually wanted to continue to grow, and we wanted to continue to see God doing great things through us. And so that's when the book came to mind, that it was looking at that concept of what happened in those churches who went from plateauing to suddenly being able to grow. What did they have in place that meant they were healthy and strong to enable them to do that? And even though I didn't feel like we were in plateau, some of the principles that were in that book were, I think, good for us to reflect on in terms of our health, our readiness to come out of this and to continue to grow. And so, it's a few ideas came together, I guess, in suggesting that we think about this.
What do you think, Karen, as a church, do you think that we were ready for momentum?
Do I think we were?
Yeah.
I think there are, as we've reflected on the concepts in this book, I think it's been a really great encouragement for us to see that out of the research that Tom Rayner did, most of the factors that he identified, we do have in place. But I think that momentum requires everyone coming with you. And so I think it also is a good reminder of the need to make sure that we continually bring everyone with us, that we're looking after the needs that they have where they're at. And so coming out of any sort of big event like COVID means people are impacted in different ways. And so that sensitivity for us to go, how do we ensure that we're meeting the needs of those who aren't quite ready to jump in and, not just get the deck chairs out of the pool, but start new things. How do we make sure that we're looking after them and strengthening them, as well as keeping an eye on growth? So, yeah, I think, yes, we are, but there's also, we don't want to run off without bringing everyone with us.
Yeah, I think that, looking at Breakout Churches for the final chapter, we kind of broke it up into chapters and each episode as we engage with that book. And Rainer says at the end that those size and numbers played a significant factor. The key was for ministry leaders and lay people wanting to make a difference.
Yeah.
And I think that's maybe feeding into what you're saying there, is that, are we ready to make a difference, and do we want to make a difference? And I think, my perception is that if us as a church is that, yes, that we do want to do that, and I think a lot of people here at Sorrow Bible Church, we're really thankful that they do want to do that. But I suppose, coming back to Breakout Churches a little bit, which is, again, as we said, is a book that we engage in a lot. Tim, I thought it worth asking you first, in looking at Breakout Churches and the book that Rainer wrote and his research, what struck you most about looking at this book and using it as a resource while we recorded this season?
Yeah, there's been lots of really interesting discussions that we've had on the book, and lots of different topics that he raises. I think one of the things that has kept floating through my mind when we haven't been recording is that idea of the vision intersection profile, and thinking about how to actually decide what you want to do as a church. And so thinking about the intersection there between a leader's passion, their particular gifts of the congregation, and also the community's needs. And as you put those two together, the sweet spot for your church is going to be there in the middle. And we talked about that a lot on episode 7. And I think that that's been really helpful as I think about why do we do what we do, and just as important, why do we not do what we don't do. And I think one of the reasons that this sticks in my head is because that's the conversation I'm often trying to have with children's ministry leaders. Whenever they've come up with a problem, I try and take them right back and go, okay, well, where's our ministry philosophy? Like, what do you actually think that you're doing? And how does this play into that? And so these kind of big meta questions that sit underneath a lot of our actual practice, I think are really significant, and gives us an evaluation tool. And I was teaching on this on Tuesday, just when we say something was a success or not, when we want to say, today was a good day in ministry, or this year was a good year in ministry, all of those words, success, good, bad, they're all evaluative words, and you need to have something you're evaluating against. Good compared to what? Bad compared to what? Success in what metric? And I think that vision intersection profile really helps you to think, is this good for us and our church at this particular point in time? And we talked a lot in that episode. There's many, many good things that we can do, but we are finite as people. We're finite as leaders, and our churches are finite, and we can't do every good idea, and neither should we. And that also feeds into one of the other conversations we had about humility. And I think one of the things about humility is that you can celebrate what another church is doing, and they might be kicking goals on a completely different vision intersection profile, because they've got particular gifts in their congregation that you don't have. And that's okay. You can look at them and go, isn't it fantastic that they are doing this ministry really well? And so, I think that's been one concept that I think I'll keep playing around with and keep thinking through.
Yeah, just off the back of that, I suppose, the vision intersection profile I think about how we do it here at Sorrow Revival Church. We kind of break it down as theology, strategy, practice. And I would say I think I've been well aware of that, but I think doing this season has made me realise how vitally important it is when you're making decisions around so many things at church. So here at Sorrow Revival Church, we say theology, Jesus changes everything. We know that what the Bible says is truth. That's the authority. Jesus died and created a new paradigm for us. So that's why we need to be sharing the gospel with people. But then also, I think what I've learned also seeing it at our planning day and stuff is that the hardest bit is strategy. Tactics or practice, or however we want to call it, the last one, how you actually do it is quite easy, but what informs that practice, the strategy, is really hard. I would say that a lot of churches that we've met with, or you've experienced in your different roles, that we would say, we're pretty aligned on theology, but oftentimes I think that's what perhaps makes us, we say we do church a little bit differently, is because of our strategy, which is to love, share the love, truth and love of Jesus to every person everywhere, and how that plays out, and changing how we do our practice from perhaps when we have a church service on a Friday night, on a Saturday night and a Sunday night, is where we can actually do that, but they all sit under the same strategy. And I think it's actually there's a dearth of strategy, perhaps not just in churches. I think it is businesses and all that kind of thing, because they don't. It's easy to come up with ideas, but when you test it against something that you're talking about, Tim, like what do you evaluate against? That's the filter that you use. Whether you are wanting to start a new ministry, how are we going to do that? Is this fitting with our strategy? Do you have a team around you? Because that's really important to us, that we do ministry as a team, not just a one-off, so people don't get burnt out. All those kind of things. Yeah, I think just saying that doing this season, looking at Breakout Churches, and then coinciding with our planning day was just like, strategy is the hardest, and that's why perhaps it's the least likely to happen, because it is often the hardest thing to do. So that's my reflections, or one of my reflections. Karen, I was just going to ask you as well, just what do you think struck you most about looking at Breakout Churches? Yeah,
I mean, I think some of the same things that you already said. I'm just picking up on the humility bit. I think, and just reflecting a little bit, again, just reading the sort of end of Tom Rainer's book again last night, his observation that even in Jim Collins' research, and when looking at those companies that were great, one of the things that stood out to me was that there was a lot of similarity in that the great companies had servant-hearted leaders. They had humble leaders. Right. And that came out in the church research that Rainer did as well. And so that really, important, that the sort of, we looked at the Acts 6-7 leader as well, and that, the leaders of these churches who were able to get through that plateau and work through that awareness that we need to be doing something different. It wasn't the crisis that led to greatness, it was the humility, the humble posture of the leader and the members to be open to reflect on what is God calling us to do different, and being prepared to sit in the pain of change. Like, some people love change, but a lot of people find it hard, and it implies that you've got to do something differently. The sitting in the pain, the awareness of that we need to do something different, the posture that goes, well, we're going to hold on to the belief that God's going to bring victory, that God's going to do something and bring change here. And we're going to be willing to go through that process of discerning what that is, to find a new way, not just to jump to just a new practice. And I think what you're saying, I'm saying something similar, I think, to what you were just saying, Joel, that the strategy bit's hard. And that's where I think the strategy bit is where you actually do have to do the hard work of looking at what is God calling us to. How do we not rely on our own wisdom and really seek out what God's trying to do through us? It was a good reminder. And I think we've got really good structures in place. And I think that's one of the things that I love about Soul, is that we spend a lot of time thinking through why we do what we do, and we don't just look at a new fad, this is a great new idea, let's just jump on it and try it out. We don't tend to do that, and that sometimes means that innovation and change is slower, but I appreciate that we take the time. And I think that humility is part of that, because it's not like any one of us thinks, we've got the answer and let's go. It's that willingness to sit together, to work it out, to listen to each other, to not take a position of power and try and force something to happen, and to wait on that wisdom that comes when we collectively pray about it. And so I think for me, the importance of the humble leader sort of rose up to be something that I reflected on a bit as we're going through this again. Yeah, and definitely, as you said, that Rainer mentioned that humble leadership was a key part of any churches that he decided to. Him and his research team decided to call those Breakout Churches. And there's also, you're talking about innovation.
you're saying there, like in the episode we talked about innovation, there was some church leaders who like went to a conference and decided to change the leadership structure with no consultation, and then continually did that. And I feel like I do feel for people that are in churches like that, because it would be almost be quite exhausting, like not knowing what's going to happen next time. I think that would be really difficult. But then, as you said, I think sometimes that we are quite an innovative church, and apologies if people think we're talking too much about it, but I think it comes back to the important thing, Tim, that you were talking about, that wherever your church is, in whatever particular context, whatever the congregation is like, it's important. It's so important to come back down to that vision intersection profile again, because if you go in with a leadership style, or like, this worked at my last church, for example, or this worked, I haven't done this before, but I think this is what it worked, but not assessing all those factors within your particular context of a church, I think that just seems such an ideal, not an ideal, it's such, again, a vitally important thing to do. I was going to ask that, because we were talking about innovation change. Tim, how do you go with change? Are you keen for it, or are you not so keen for it?
I don't mind experimenting with new ideas, but when I've found something that works, I don't like changing that.
Okay.
So, just my workflow habits. I had a system that worked for me in terms of emails coming in, creating tasks, calendars. That was all kind of working well, and I went through the whole, getting things done kind of process.
David Allen, isn't that?
David Allen, to refine that to a point where it was working really well for me, and so I really liked that. And then I got a new computer, and the apps didn't work with each other, and I'm just kind of, then I get frustrated and go, it's kind of worked, and I've had to try and work out new things, which I haven't settled on a new system yet. But so I don't mind change and experimenting new ideas, but I don't like to do it very often. I think is kind of where my personality naturally fits.
What about you, Karen? Are you a change merchant?
Yeah, I love change.
Me too.
If I create it for myself, if it's not imposed on me, I run towards it.
Do you end up? I think I'm pretty similar. Do you end up going like almost like, I'm bored with doing it this way and I need to freshen it up?
There's probably an element of that. But I think it's also about improvement. Like I don't think it's just about change for change's sake. It is. There's probably a better way. Like this worked well, but it could be better if this is tweaked or this is tweaked. So I think I naturally look for something that's going to improve it, not just change it.
Can you give us an example?
I don't think I'm
Okay, sorry, finish what you said.
I was just going to say, I don't think I'm like a early adopter in terms of technology and stuff like that, but I think it's more in just my openness to changing the way that things are done. An example, I think like in training that I do, if I'm delivering the same workshop numbers of times, they're always going to be different because I'll deliver it and go, that activity didn't work. I think we could spend more time, and I always tweak. So every time I'd do it differently. When I was working at the university in that setting, and I was running a program that had to roll out across the whole university, that was pretty challenging because I had to have some standardised nature to that. So I had to find ways to make it interesting for myself each time. And particularly if I was running the same workshop multiple times in the same day, that was really hard. So it had to be different for me each time. Otherwise I got lost in the, have I already said this stuff before? So part of it is about keeping it interesting for me. But it does have a layer of, it's got to be leading somewhere better as well.
And it plays in again to what we were talking about in the innovation episode, was that the Rayner's research revealed that the breakout churches were slow to look at innovation, but when they committed full. They were all in with that rather than, and that's similar to what we talked about. Also, is like we like to say, build a bridge to a new reality. That it's almost like we're going to take this change as far as we can before we actually. No, maybe not implement it, but it's like when we decide to make a change, let's build it in a way so that we can just come back to it, but we're still going to fully commit to it, I think. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a few reasons why we might do that. I think one is that we, as I said earlier, like we want to bring everybody with us, and so sometimes not everyone's ready to cross the bridge at the same time. So keeping things connected is helpful. And some people just want to see, like, is that going to work before I come over?
Can we make it across the bridge?
Yeah, like is that stable over there? And then I'll come. And that's okay too. And so we want to bring people with us. But I think the point about Breakout Churches and innovation as well is that they weren't seeking the innovation to be the solution to the growth issue or whatever it was that they were being challenged by. It accelerated it. So they were already on a path that was improving or was leading where they felt that was aligned with their vision. And like I guess Tim's example of his organisation systems, it enabled and facilitated that to happen. It wasn't the only solution. So Tim's got to engage with his system, and it's him that's going to be efficient. It's not the systems, but the systems facilitate it. And I think that's what we try and do. That the innovation that we try is not just for the sake of say meals, for example. We don't just do meals because we want to have great meals. We don't. Because it could then become all about that innovation. So how can we make our meals better and better and better? It's not about that. It facilitates something else. And so I think that's what we do well, that because we've taken time to think about the theology and strategy, then innovation sits in the practice and it aligns. When we've done that thinking, it aligns and it does facilitate it rather than be the solution.
Yeah, and it's funny how we've talked about strategy being the hard thing, but if you perhaps do the hard yards, then the practice is quite easy, and it's also quite flexible, and also perhaps gives more freedom to actually allow people to do what they want. I mean, that again, that's another thing we talked about, was the freedom expectation paradox. Was the people? Some churches felt like there was just an authoritarian leader that just told them what to do, and they had no freedom to actually try to engage in their passions and their gifts to be able to make it something of their own as well. But then I think, again, if you're really strong in your theology and strategy, you're able to allow people to have a bit more freedom to be able to do that. And I mean, talking about that in Breakout Churches, it basically says something similar. It's that as long as these people knew exactly what they're doing, it allowed them to have that high expectation as well, so that they wouldn't be, we want to put in the effort, but we can be creative in our ways that we can try and meet that, which is why, again, I think the strategy is really important. Tim, I was going to ask you though, we're talking about momentum throughout this series. In your many years of experience working in ministry in many different ways, what do you think is holding churches back in maybe Sydney, or Sydney's our particular context, or you could say Australia? What do you think is holding them back from building momentum that we're talking about?
Yeah, I think, that missing piece of strategy is often significant. And so often we don't know why we do what we do. And so we can't then assess why we do things, and we don't have a good grid through which to then investigate new ideas. So as you were talking, one of the things that I was thinking about with that freedom expectation matrix, the churches that were low freedom and low expectations, and the way you describe those, Joel, is they just keep doing what they've always done. And so it might be that you picked up an idea once from a podcast that you should do meals regularly. And so you just do meals regularly, and in 5 years' time, you're not quite sure why you did meals. It's draining everyone. It's feeling really exhausting, but you just kind of have picked this up and you feel like you just got to keep running with it. And so you then don't know how to break out of that tension. I was having a conversation on Facebook this week.
That's always going to go down well.
Oh no, it was a good conversation. It was a closed group, so it's a lot more sane conversation. But no, someone was just expressing the difficulty they were finding in staffing volunteers for their children's ministry, and those who were doing it were really faithful but really tired, and there was a bit of a frustration of how do I get more people involved, but how do I keep doing this ministry? And one of the things that I said, well, do you have to do it? Like, do you have to do youth and kids ministry? They're obviously great things. I mean, I'm a passionate children's minister. I lecture in it, I teach in it, I coach in it. Like, I do it. It's like, but people can grow, and young people can grow as disciples without a structured children's and youth ministry. Like, why are you doing it? And I think for a number of churches, and potentially this one, was, well, because we do. Like, that's, you have a church, you've always do children's and youth ministry. And so even just the freedom to be able to think, well, what if we didn't run structured children's ministry? What might that mean? Well, it might mean that a season of, leaving fallow, when you leave a field just to grow weeds for a year, is actually quite enriching for the soil. And it might be that actually not doing children's ministry next year in the formal structured way that you have been doing it, with the high resource expectation on leadership and all of those things, actually means that you can have a period of restoration for your leaders, where they can actually, if they're feeling burnt out from years of COVID and pressures and health scares and the anxiety that comes from the unknown that we've had over the last 3 years and all of those kinds of things, if people just read to rest, then rest. Maybe better than burnt out leaders running a unsustainable ministry, maybe a time of restoration in order to have healthy leaders in a year's time, and a church that's really excited about ministry again. Maybe that's a fair trade. I don't know. But have the freedom to think about those kinds of things. But you've got to think about your strategy. And again, if the strategy, it's not just practice. It's not just theology and practice. The Bible says that children are disciples of Jesus, and therefore we must run Sunday school. It's like, hold on, there's a missing piece there. Sunday school may not be the only way in which you can express that theology, that children can know and love Jesus for themselves. Adolescents can know and love Jesus and can express discipleship in adolescent type ways. Therefore, we must have Friday afternoon youth group. Do we? Must we? What's the strategy in the middle? And there may be other strategies that actually allow you to express those theologies and represent them in different practices. So I think that's one of the things that can hold people back, is if we don't understand our strategy well, then we can be doing practices and we're not quite sure why, or we think that this is the only way that it can happen. So I think that might be one thing that I've thought of. I've got a couple of others, but Karen, have you got things that you can recognise?
Sure. I think one of the things is, we've talked about the National Church Life surveys and other surveys on this podcast and others, I think. And, the recognition that the majority of churches across Australia are not actually growing. Some of them are stable and they're getting new people, but they're sort of losing people at the same rate. Some of them are in decline, but only about a third or maybe even less than that are actually growing. And I think one of the things that I think Raina helpfully points out is one of the reasons why I think that's happening is when churches, the leadership teams actually face the reality of, our membership's plateaued, they don't do the hard work of sitting in the painful reality of that and being open to, what does that mean? What does that mean for us? What changes do we need to make? What is God doing? They jump straight to, and I think it's like your idea of I went to a conference and come back and implement. They jump straight. So those who recognise we have to do something different and jump to the solution and try and patch their practices with some idea that they've found from somewhere else. They don't actually take the time to really think about what does it mean for us. I think that's, you end up with a whole lot of ideas that get tried and maybe don't work, or get done for a while and then stop it, which ultimately feels like you're doing nothing. Or there's others who just won't accept that they need to do anything. They just, and just ignore the reality that, the church is declining, or it's less than it could be. And I think Raina even talks about in some of the surveys in the comparison churches where they went and asked the congregation, what do you think of the church? And they're like, the fact is it's declining, but the members are saying, we're doing great with this aspect of ministry and this and this. And so not actually realistically facing the truth of what's happening in their churches. So, I think they're some of the reasons. And it's hard, change is hard. We've talked about that before, that sitting in that, recognizing, oh, maybe I've contributed to this, and what does that mean for me? And it's not easy to feel that conviction or that rebuke of. Yeah. I think to avoid conflict, which a lot of people want to do, they just don't do anything about it.
It's almost like almost an avoidance of responsibility, like we're tempted to do that in many things, but it's also like even if you're in church and you like, oh, but I'm here, but I think Raina talked about people estimating their attendance of 30% higher than it actually was, or just saying no, nothing needs to change. But like
it's all going
over 7 years, I think there was one church the attendance had declined some 60% which is ignoring the fact that probably doesn't help you actually build momentum any easily. Tim, you had a couple of other ideas though for why.
Yeah, one of the other things, and this is just, it's been a personal reflection of mine as I think about my own life, as I think about the ministries I look at and when I've been doing study over the last few years, but really thinking through this, the idea of formation. What does it actually mean to be formed as a disciple? And so one of the things I use regularly in my writing and my lecturing and my teaching is, that we are head, heart, hands, that, discipleship is growing in our knowledge of God, our love of God, and our obedience to God. And it's a holistic place, and it's putting all those three together that actually creates forming disciples. But we are in a tradition which really heavily emphasises the head knowledge of faith. And part of that is our Reformation heritage. We've got quite a intellectual and scholastic type heritage that comes from, Calvin and Luther were, massive brains, right? Like they're just writing heaps of stuff, very, very smart. You go through the Puritan movement, huge, like writing really, really great stuff. And they're the sort of the champions of our heritage, I suppose. But this idea that, I think it's James K.A. Smith that talks about this enlightenment idea that humans are just brains on a stick, which overemphasises the head. And this isn't a Christian idea. This is just in the Enlightenment. That's kind of where it came from. So there's a lot of Enlightenment philosophers, which is paralleling the Reformation in history, that emphasise that knowledge is the answer to everything. And so you get schools and universities, and all we need to do is teach better, and people will become better humans. And one of the things that's neglected, and this is where a lot of more recent things that I've been listening to and reading about formation are missing out on the holistic nature of formation. That we're actually we're embodied people, and so therefore what we do with our body matters. But we often, I think in our tribe, we think, I'll do a sermon series on the fruits of the Spirit. And then the output will be that everyone will be more loving, joyful, peaceful, patient, kind, goodness, faithful and self-controlled. And then you wonder why, because you've talked for 30 minutes on each of those over 9 weeks, that actually people are exactly the same. And part of it is we overemphasise that just intellectual knowledge will actually change us, and we're actually more fully human than that. We are more fully embodied than that. And other disciplines that we do during the week and each day are really formative. And so if we hear 30 minutes on being self-controlled and then spend 6 days, 23 and a half hours practicing lack of self-control with our food, with our attention, with our smart devices, with our screens, then what is actually discipling us more? It's not the 30-minute sermon, no matter how cracker it was, no matter how good the preaching was, no matter how sharp the points, if we're not embodying those things. And I think that we as a tribe have relied really heavily on the spoken word, and I'm in no way pulling down the sermon. I think the preached word is absolutely central to what we do when we gather together as God's people. But we've stopped there, and we haven't dug deeper into some of those other formative practices. And so that's one of the things I think, and what it means is to kind of come back to to attempt to answer your question. Why are we not breaking out? Because we actually have ill-formed disciples. And so our discipleship, we're being malformed by the world, and we think the answer is just more intellect, but we're not brains on sticks. We're actually embodied people. And so our churches haven't helped us, I think, to actually be fully embodied people and to express discipleship. And so therefore, this is a personal reflection of me, I feel like I'm a stunted disciple because I rely really heavily on my brain and read, and I listen to a lot of things and I read a lot of things, and I really love study. But I'm really poor at doing all the other practices that come out of a good spiritual life. And I don't think it's just me. As I look around and I listen to a lot of children's talks, and I listen to a lot of sermons, and I visit youth groups, and again, it comes down to, I'll teach you this bit of Nehemiah, see you later, and just expect that the child is now going to be a fully formed disciple of Jesus as they walk into school tomorrow. It's like, why do we think that is going to happen? Like there's a massive disconnect there. And I think we do that in our churches and in our Bible studies. And so that's another thing that's kind of on my mind a lot at the moment. And again, it's partly personal reflection, but it's also partly cultural in the way that we do things.
What does it look like? I mean, you're talking about head, heart, hands, and you talk maybe an over prioritization on head. What does heart and hands look like then? If you're saying, what would you like to see? What would you like it to look like when it's not perhaps the way that you think is ideal at the moment? Yeah,
so I mean, head is a really important part. So learning more about Jesus. So I mean, we as a tribe, as an evangelical reformed churches, we do that really, really well. So I don't think there's any issue there. The heart aspect, what's learning about Jesus is not the same as learning about Shakespeare or some historical character that I can know about, but I can never know personally, relationally. Jesus is risen. He's risen and ascended, and I can have, because of the Spirit living in me, I can have an actual relationship with him that involves sitting with him and talking with him and listening to his promptings and experiencing those kinds of things. And there's a whole lot of our affections are shaped or should be shaped towards an actual relationship with a living, real person. And so what does that look like? I mean, it's prayer, it's singing, it's silence and quietness, which again in our technological age is really hard to come by. So it's all of those things. So in children's ministry, one of the things I ask 3 questions to try and hit these 3 points. So the first question about the head, I ask, what is something new that you've learned or old that you've been reminded of because of today? And just to think about, I got reminded that blah, blah, blah. So in terms of the heart, how might I talk to King Jesus because of what we've done today in kids' church, scripture, etc., whatever it is? And so that just prompting them to say, actually, this is a living relationship. I can actually, it's not just information. I now can turn that information into a way of talking to God, expressing to God my joy, my love, my fear, my anxiety, my worry, whatever it is. And then the hands, James famously says, faith without deeds is dead. Jesus in the upper room says, those who love me obey my commands. And so we need to be shaping people towards an ethic that is, all of our decisions, all of our thinking comes from an obedience to Jesus. So the question is, well, what can I do today or this week because of what we've talked about in kids ministry today? And so that helps us to put those kind of things into action.
What do you think, Karen, from what Tiffany's saying?
Yeah, I mean, I think I totally agree. I think learning discipleship is so much more than just learning about God. Definitely. Over the last couple of months, I've had the opportunity to go to a few other conferences and things, and overwhelmingly, I've been really convicted about the whole need for deeper discipleship. So, yeah, totally resonate with that. I think it's also about putting yourself, maybe the church facilitating it, but you as an individual follower of Jesus doing it too, putting yourself in a place where you can serve beyond yourself. So, I've in in lots of times over my life, tried to serve in places where I don't feel like I have the skills to just do it. And with people that are not people that I'm really familiar with, because then you have to trust in God to help you, to enable you to do the thing. It gives you insight into people that aren't like yourself, and I think that helps you to apply the knowledge. Like, how is what I know about God informing what's going on in this situation? And so, not shielding yourself from some of the hard things in the world, like, being aware of what's going on in terms of people who are, across the world at the moment and struggling in, refugee camps, or with, food shortages, or in, places where there's lots of violence. I think it's easy for us to not know about any of that stuff. So what we do in the 23 and a half hours of our day when we're not listening to a sermon, I think we've got to be really careful about what we allow to shape us, what we watch, what we engage with, what activities we do, and that's also about discipleship, making choices that make you align your life with what you know in your head to be what God wants for you. So I think it's a much more holistic approach to what does it mean to be a disciple. It's more than just knowing about God, it's actually knowing God and letting that shape who I am and what I do. And I remember one thing that as I think back in terms of parenting, one thing I regret was doing something with a question that my son asked me years ago. He was about 5 or 6, and he was really concerned about homelessness, and I didn't until a few years later go and get him to actually engage with it. But I think that was really formative for him, because he was concerned about it, he'd heard about it, he knew about it, and so we went and we served at a Christmas event where there was a lot of homeless people, and we were there amongst them. We had lunch with them, and that was a really formative time for him in understanding what's going on in this world. So I think that's a long time ago, but I think putting ourselves in places where we have to challenge our thinking and make it make sense in the reality of what God's doing in the world.
Yeah, I think it's actually it's interesting, because I kind of think it's something kind of similar. I think I was kind of in line. Maybe I was just driving home at some point the other week and thinking about it's almost like I'm not consuming enough of the Bible, and not in a way like I say that in relation to the other things that I'm consuming, rather than the Bible is just there to be consumed. It's not like the other things in it. It's like it talks about being sharper than a double-edged sword. Like, it does way more than just. It's not just entertainment, and balancing that with how much entertainment I'm watching or engaging in compared to how much I'm engaging in the Bible, first of all, but then like, what is that doing? What's the outworking of that as well? I was thinking, though, we were talking about, we've talked about the Barna research a lot, Tim, but you talked about the almost too much of the head knowledge, and I wonder if that's kind of similar, reflecting what that research said, where people felt like they were willing to share the gospel but didn't know how to. It almost sounds like people have the head knowledge but are almost not ready or are not sure how to engage with people to be able to share that knowledge. But also, like, it's more than just knowledge too. I think that's the other thing, isn't it? It's the spiritual nature is perhaps the thing that we're maybe not putting as much emphasis on. So that makes a lot of sense. And also, I mean, I've recently there's a pastor in America who's brought out a thing called Rule of Life, which is very much talking about spiritual disciplines and things like that. And that's quite fascinating. And it's really making me think about, how am I doing it? And I think it may almost, it's almost sowing the seeds of, like, that's what we might do in our next Shoggozelva season, is talk about spiritual disciplines and how we can better read the Bible, understand the Bible, and do many of the things that you're talking about, Tim.
I think, can I just make another comment? I think one of the things that we do well here at Soulies is right from the first sort of time that people engage with us is encourage service. So there's always ways to get involved in service, whether if you're new and you can help out cleaning up after a meal, but all of the roles that we have in our church, we always talk about the importance of mission and discipleship in everything that we do. And so I think one of the other things that we do well here is use the sort of service opportunities in just to help shape people as well. So, you know, as you're serving in a team, you've got an opportunity to be learning from each other and seeing something modelled to you. And so I think that's important too, the giving people an opportunity to get involved and use their skills and think through, well, how is what I know informing how I serve?
Mm-hmm. And also the idea of, I was just talking about the idea of consumption. And if we're only coming to consume church, then it is that only thing of the half an hour and then that's it. Whereas I think the Bible commands us and says that go to church to serve first, and then as a result, you're able to be like a lot of people serve you more as well. Like it's this cyclical thing because we're meeting under God's word, serving each other as He asks us to in love, that you end up receiving more love as well, rather than just turn up, consume the church for your purposes and then leave. And I think that's, again, that almost comes back to the strategy discussion we're coming about. If we have a strategy that only says turn up for an hour, half an hour at the most, and then off you go, and then go be Christians for the rest of the rest of your life. I think we're perhaps missing something there. And I'm actually really reminded of what Stu was talking about. He actually came up with it on the podcast. We talked about how models or even strategies or visions can become institutionalized, and we do that thing of we're just going to, that's how we've always done it. But he says we need to remain flexible in that because culture is constantly changing. And then we're talking about the shock absorber in action. Our young people know definitely at the coalface of change. We can use the biblical wisdom of our older saints to be able to interpret that and come up with ways to actually interpret the church. But then also interpret how we do church and express church. But then also he said one way to stop institutionalization and getting stuck in a rut of looking to just do the same thing over and over was to institutionalize relationships rather than that model. Or we've talked about purpose-driven life. The purpose-driven model by Rick Warren was, there were some churches in this book of Breakout Churches, he said, well, if we just put purpose-driven life in, then it'll sort everything out. Again, that's not the actual case. But I'd love to get your reactions on that, though. Tim, let's go with you first. What does institutionalizing relationships mean to you?
It means that you're putting relationships on top of ministry, like as in terms of priorities. So we are friends who together as friends, the body of Christ, go and do ministry. And that means that the relationships are the key marker there. It means that the people in your church are not your tools towards a utilitarian end of greater ministry, because that's the kind of leadership which ends up in people burning out, or when people want to tap out of ministry, you get frustrated at them. Don't you care? Like, why can't you prioritize your life to serve the church? Rather than actually recognizing that people have particular gifts, skills, and capacities, and that you actually you want to care for them, like that they are the priority. You want to see them grow as disciples of Jesus, and as we've said, part of growing as a disciple of Jesus is their service. But there's lots of ways that can manifest itself. Whereas if we start from a ministry and structure model before relationships, then all we're doing is I must maintain these ministries, and I'll just keep pulling people in, and if they burn out, chuck them out, find someone new, just to keep the system moving. There was something recently, last 6 months or so, about Amazon and the high turnover of staffing at Amazon that they were burning through staff really quickly in order to make sure all of their systems worked well. And someone had worked out, like, if they keep on this trajectory, then actually they've only got like some single digit number of years before they've gone through everyone in America.
Wow.
And so clearly this is not sustainable. But again, that's a really heightened case of I care more about the system and making sure that the business of business works.
The delivery.
The delivery of the business works rather than caring about the actual people. And sadly, we can get caught up with that in church as well. Again, when we think that I've got to run these ministries, like I need to have a functional meal ministry or youth ministry or children's or outreach or whatever it is, we've got to make sure that carols happens, and it's going to require 50 people to make sure it pulls off, and I'm just going to work those people really hard to make sure it happens. Now, if you've invested really deeply in relationships and you have 50 people that are so chomping at the bit, ready to go, they just love serving and they're really, really excited about pulling off your church's carols event, fantastic. Go and do your carols event and do it well.
And the high expectations that it makes it easier to meet those high expectations.
That's it. Yeah. You've got people with you. But that's what it means to be putting. And so practically speaking, you're investing in your teams. You're caring about people. You're spending time with them. I've coached people. There was one guy I was coaching who was struggling to connect with some of his team. He was feeling like they were feeling that he was being really onerous, and he was trying not to be, but he was also trying to make ministry run. And my advice to him was, this couple of leaders that you're really struggling to connect with, invite them over to your place, have dinner and play a board game.
Yes.
And he goes, okay, and then we do some talk about ministry. I'm like, no, that's it.
Just
And then you wave them goodbye and you say, thanks for coming and playing a board game with me.
Yeah.
And he's like, oh, okay. But that was it, like that, because it's about the investment in the relationship. Yeah. And if we can consistently do that, then they're the types of things that will actually build high trust in the team, and people are willing to go with you. And when they don't have capacity, you've got such a great investment with them that you give them what we talked about a few weeks ago, that ministry grace and ministry slide, that, when people are feeling, I'm really tired right now, and you say, totally cool, man. I love you as a brother or sister in Christ. The most important thing for me is your spiritual health, emotional health, and I'm going to support you in that. And if that means you can't commit to this ministry, great. Or if you need to slide into another ministry, you're not going to be able to do weekly youth ministry anymore, but you can do a once a month reading roster or prayer roster if that's what you have capacity for, great. And so use all of those things are just putting relationships first. And then the ministry flows out of the relationships you have.
As friends or
as friends, I think
that's really key. And I've loved doing ministry as friends since I've been here at Soul Revival Church and doing ministry there. Institutionalising relationships.
Yeah, I think I think Tim summed it up really well. But I guess the other thing I would add is the idea of it becoming the norm. Like, so I think when the expectation that we're going to be friends. It's not just an expectation, and if I happen to like you, I'm going to be a friend. It is actually the way that we do things. It's just natural that we do it as friends. So I think the idea of institutionalising something means that it becomes embedded in the way that everything works. And so it's not just when we have a group of people who seem to gel as friends, that's when we do ministry as friends. It's not that. That's just the way that we do it. And as people come in, new people come into the church and see it's going to look different, and it might be a bit unusual for them at first, but to help people to see that's what's actually most important. If it means in some of our plants that some things don't happen because we don't have people in the roles, or they're tired and need a break and whatever, that's okay, because what's more important is the friendships, the relationships that we have. And so I think it's about allowing the structures, the culture, to embed it into the way we do things. It's just naturally how we
and I think
we work.
A big part of that is also proximity as well. We're talking about, if you only have a kind of consumer-based model of church, there's not a lot of time to build relations unless you step outside the church, but then that leads you to only maybe focusing on a certain group of people. Whereas and this is why we intentionally do it here at Soul Revival, is because we build time before and after the services to build those relationships and to share lives with each other, share our lives with each other, and to learn about each other and be able to. I mean, I love what you're saying there, Tim, about sending this guy saying, I can't get going what I want to get going. But if you're wisdom was to let's focus on the relationship first, and then to be able to learn about people, share lives with each other, so that we can understand what's going on with each other's lives. It's a very different thing to being perhaps in a paid role, like a job outside of church, where it's like, to get paid, I have to work with you to make this happen. Whereas I think it's very different. Like the central point for us when we come to church anywhere is that it's based around God's love for us. So then we can, in some small way, put out, express that love to other people.
Yes.
And to be doing that as a ministry together first, and then the reason we're doing this ministry together is to, again, express God's love out through, hopefully, for more people to come to church and to know that love as well.
I think the other thing too, like your example of the person in youth ministry who really hasn't got the capacity anymore to do anything more than maybe read the Bible once in a while in church. I think institutionalising relationships also means that friendship's not lost when that person goes to now just serve in, once a month. And that I think sometimes people stay in roles in the workplace or in church ministry because if they step out, they feel like I'm going to lose touch with that person who I liked serving with. And so I think the other concept about institutionalising relationships is the friendship doesn't end if you stop serving in my team. That it continues on, and because I love you, I'm wanting to put your needs first.
Which also requires structures that will facilitate
that hanging out together outside the time that we serve in youth ministry together or wherever.
I've heard of there was one church I was chatting with earlier this year who they were saying so many school leavers and young adults in the church do youth ministry because that is the only space that they have in order to be friends with each other. And they're almost to the point where they're not particularly interested in youth ministry, but it's the only way that they can keep hanging out with these other young adults as friends. And it's lovely that they are friends, but you want to say, well, actually now you've got to a point where you might have people who don't want to do youth ministry, but they're only there to do these friends. And that you say, well, that's not particularly healthy either. And so for them, it's, you need to have created structures. And so I think what we have at Soul Revival, so, late night on a Saturday night, where anyone who is, upper high school and young adults, and I mean through to anyone, can hang out, but it's largely young adults who are in that space. Whether you're a youth leader or not, that can be your community space. So you can be friends with all of those people. You can embed every week into a deep friendship with those people, and it means without having to be in ministry. And so there's those kind of things as well.
I was also thinking in relation to that, talking about relationships, but also Stu said just after that, if you want to build momentum, look at building momentum in the relationships first. So rather than we've got to rebuild all the structures, we've got to do all the things that we were doing perhaps before COVID, or maybe you're a new leader coming in and you're like, we need to make all these changes and make this happen. I think the key is and I suppose this is an encouragement for leaders, is take your team out for a meal, or have a barbecue at your place, or go down and have a picnic at. We live on the East Coast, so you go down to the beach and have a picnic there, or go to the park and have a picnic, or get everyone to come along and bring their families on and just spend time with each other first. And maybe at some point you can talk about, this is what I'm thinking about. I mean, this is what I'm thinking about this in terms of my own leadership as well. But let's just hang out and talk about what would you love to do at church? Like that's trying to harness some of the passions and gifts as well. And out of that, you may get the vision intersection profile as well as like, we could be doing this ministry because we can build a real sustainable team that can really make this happen. And I think I think that's probably the real key one that I've learned from this, and didn't come out straight out of Breakout Churches doing this season, was it's all about, because Jesus reconciles us to God and also to each other, that we can build something really special through God's love by spending a lot of time with each other in order to help other people know that. And again, almost before COVID, it was like we're used to everything running. We're used to it because at Soul Revival, we had built it up slowly over the years since we planted the church 10 years ago. But unless you do that again, I think there's a real danger that you might, there's a danger that it couldn't fall apart. I think that would be a concern for me, and you've got to rebuild it again. But the fun thing is, rebuilding relationships is actually pretty fun, or at least re-establishing relationships is actually pretty fun to do. I don't know what do you think about that, but final thoughts, I suppose. We're almost finished this episode. You got any final thoughts to throw out? We've done a lot of reflections and final thoughts already, but just one that you might think you haven't said yet.
No, I think I've said everything that was in my mind. Karen?
Great.
No, not really. No, I well, maybe just, and I think we've touched on this, but momentum is going to come out of health and connectedness. And so I think it's always healthy. It's always good practice to be self-reflective and to think, whatever framework you use. I mean, we've used Breakout Churches to help us think through that. But, I think that practice of examining yourself, making sure that everyone's with you is important, whether you're plateauing or not, and that momentum is going to come from that place of health, or it's not sustainable if it doesn't. So you might see growth for a time, but that's not going to be sustainable if the church is not healthy.
Yeah, I think that's really good. The other thing I just thought of then was also we talked about humble leadership and moving along with the congregation in humility and trying to lead them in that, but also the fact that of the breakout churches in Rainer's research, they all had, I think the average leadership tenure was 21.6 years, which is, I've probably experienced that, especially with Stu being in leadership, and I think all my leaders that I've experienced is longevity was a really important thing, especially even in the youth ministry where we would have our leaders lead us all the way through from year 7 to year 12. But that was something that really struck me. I've never been to any other churches besides Guyme Anglican under Soul Revival and being here at Soul Revival Church, but to see, I think sometimes that is not the case, perhaps even in Sydney, or I don't know what it's like in Australia, but the idea of leading for a long time, I said on Chip Lunch the other day that God is so eternal.
Eternity's a long time.
Yeah, but that's the thing. Like, if you again, a tiny piece of that is, well, perhaps then maybe we should also be looking at how can we be that. Or we're fallen people, but how can we be that long-term version of that for other people as well as leaders? And I think that's a real fascinating thing to keep thinking about, and also like something like kind of really inspiring that. And really thankful for leaders like Stu and Matt, who established the church with Stu, that they stuck it out for a very, very long time, out of love, not out of out of a grumbling necessity. It was like, we want to do this because it's so important to us, what God's put in our hearts to love other people, so I think that's the last thing. But cool. Happy to wrap up the episode, guys. Thank you very much for your contribution.
Thank you for your leadership as always, Joel.
No worries. Thank you very much. Thank you for the idea, Karen. Can you start? And all these your contributions over this season, Tim. So thank you very much. And it was nice to bookend the season with yourself, Karen. So thank you very much. If you do have any questions, when you're listening or watching us, you can email me at joel@shockabsorber.com.au. We'd be very happy to answer them on the particular podcast that you wish to question us on. Thank you, as always, to our producer, Eck. That's the same guy, Dave, but he wants to be called Eck. But I'm only saying that for the audience. He might beep his name out. We'll see what he does with the edit. But thank you, as always, to him, our editor, for doing it. And as always, thank you to Stu, also who's been contributing a lot to this season, and to Karen and Tim again. Thank you very much. And we'll finish with a one-way. Oh, by the way, I should say, just before we do a one-way, sorry, we're going to have a break for a couple of weeks. Just wait until Stu comes back from his lovely holiday. But also, I think we're looking at a season of around the spiritual discipline thing. So if you do have any questions about that, send them in, and we can answer them as we go through the season. All right, let's finish with a one-way.
One way.